which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have touched, the word of life.
Can you recall that you either participated in or witnessed that you said you would never believe in your life could happen? Things that you might have seen on the news or somewhere that happened to someone else, but not to you. Couldn't happen to you. It seems so far away. I wonder if the people who were involved, though, in the Holocaust might have had those thoughts previously. What about the people in Hawaii who woke up that fateful Sunday morning in 1941 to the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Certainly something that could have never happened. What about those people in Sarajevo, Bosnia, that hosted the Olympics that time and built their city up so beautifully, and now it's completely destroyed, it's war-torn, and there's cemeteries in the place of some of the tracks and the places where the athletes met and where they trained? Or what about those people who were walking the streets in Hiroshima, Japan, and the atomic bomb was dropped upon them? What about people who have experienced floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, fire, volcanic eruptions, and their life is forever changed? Everything is ruined. Or who can forget that fateful day, September the 11th, 2001? When we witnessed, we saw, it just wasn't something we heard about, we saw it, and we saw it over and over again. Those planes flying in to the buildings, and the buildings collapsing, and lives lost by the thousand. How could that be? How could that happen? Isn't that the cry? Why? Why, God? Why have you let this happen? That's a lot like Jeremiah must have felt as he penned the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is a personal journal written by the prophet Jeremiah as he saw everything he knew come to an end. The city of God, Jerusalem, the place of his chosen people, the place where God would abide at the temple, gone at the hands of the Babylonians. The enemy had come in and had destroyed the city. And we're going to see in the book of Lamentations that he has penned his thoughts and what he saw and felt that horrible day when everything was forever changed. Lamentations is a difficult book. It's not one you want to sit down to relax and read. It's hard. In a sense today, as we study this book, it's as though we are attending the funeral of the city of Jerusalem. There are only two bright spots in the book. One is the hope that we find in chapter 3, and the other is the color of the suit that I'm wearing today. Lamentations means to cry aloud, to wail in grief. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet or the suffering prophet or the lonely prophet. And he was known for that because, you remember, he was commanded not to marry. And so he was lonely. And he suffered greatly. He has been prophesying to these people for 40 years. And they have paid no attention to him. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine telling people truth and warning them, and they do not listen? The warnings were refused. And listen to this. They were refused even after these people had seen the devastation that has taken place in Israel, the northern kingdom. The Assyrians have come down and harshly treated them and taken them away or killed them. This is really close to home. But even so, they are basically saying, it won't happen to us because we're God's chosen people. We have the temple here. God will never, ever let this happen. And yet, it does. You know, so many people today believe that God is only a God of love, that there is no judgment. And so they choose many times to study the New Testament in place of the Old Testament because they don't like that judgment stuff. They want to read about Jesus and Jesus being about love. And he is, of course. But you make a huge mistake if you think that there is no judgment in the New Testament. You need to read from Acts chapter 5 and see God's immediate judgment on Ananias and Sapphira when they sinned. And also, I wanted to read to you from Hebrews chapter 10, and it says, "It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God," and some translations say, of an angry God. There is judgment in the New Testament as well, because God is the perfect parent. He's not an indulgent parent. Surely you and I, as parents, when we warn our children about consequences and they disobey us anyway, we follow through, don't we, with those promises of discipline. God does the same thing, but he's far more patient than we are. He's waited years and years and years, but they have refused every prophet's words. Now, the first thing we're going to see in our study is that Jeremiah describes Jerusalem's desolation. And then we're going to see that the city is deserted by its inhabitants and former friends. Notice the word former friends. We pick up in chapter 1 and we see that the city was once crowded, but now it's as lonely as a widow. And it was once beheld as a princess, but now is mocked. People are mocking it, and the people, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, are carried off and are enslaved. Gone are the former comforters and lovers and friends. They've now become the enemy. Gone are the feasts and the festivals that they loved so much. The roads were at one time full of pilgrims coming into Jerusalem, but no more. The roads are empty because there is no one coming and there are no festivals. The city has been cut off and it has been surrounded for a long period of time. Gone is the majesty and the royalty that was once there. Even the army has fled. None of them are left. God's city that was so esteemed is now laughed at. The enemy is glad. The former friends think it's funny, and they are enjoying the misery of Jerusalem. What a sad thing. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? We're told because Israel sinned and because they forgot to consider the future. Look with me at verse 9 of chapter 1. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She did not consider her future. Therefore she has fallen astonishingly. She has no comforter. That's what happens so many times. We don't consider the future because we think nothing will ever change. We think it'll stay just as it is. And we're really happy with that. And we never think beyond that. I heard a story one time about a family that was torn apart because the husband decided to have a midlife crisis and have an affair. And he had an affair with a younger woman, and it split his family. It turned his children against him. And he went off and he married this younger woman. It was really hard on his family. His wife had to go back to school. She had to go to work. She had to sometimes hold down 2 jobs. But she did a wonderful, wonderful job of raising those children. And the children were very grateful to her. They turned out really great. But they were really against their dad. They had nothing to do with him. He went his merry way for a while, but then his health began to fail. And his new young wife left him. And so he was left all alone. Years passed, and we switched to a scene in a church. It's a very happy scene. There is the mom and her grown children, and they are dedicating the brand new grandbaby. And they are so excited. And they're all down at the front, and all of their friends are surrounding them. And way back in the balcony, under the shadows, is a broken, unhealthy, miserable old man, much older than his years. And you know why? Because he didn't consider the future. He didn't think about all of this. This that he should have been involved in. He should have been a part of this. He should have been down there with them. But he's not able to be because he went his own way and he sinned and he didn't consider the future. That's what happened to Israel. They always thought, it won't happen to us. We find that heathens are in the temple. The people come in that are the unclean, that God had commanded that they never be in there, and here they are, trampling through it. Gone are the once precious things, those things that they had to have. You know, that stuff that we have to have, and it's so important and we stock it up. Now it's gone, and you know why? Because they've had to sell it. They've had to sell all of it in order to eat, because the city's been cut off and there is no food. The city is devastated. Nothing is as it was. There's no comfort. The following verses, 12 through 22, are given from the city's perspective, are given from Jerusalem's perspective. And Jerusalem is really in anguish and crying out to God in her misery and in her desolation. Look at verse 12, if you will. Is it nothing to all of you who pass this way? Look and see if there is any pain like my pain, which was severely dealt out to me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. They know it's from the Lord. They realize now that they did not obey him. And they're crying out and they're saying, don't you see my pain? Don't you care? Doesn't anybody care? And nobody does. Nobody cares. And the city sees that it's too late. But now they see their sin. But it's too late for them to do anything about it. They've had all this opportunity. And God has finally brought his wrath. They see not only the city's sin, but they see the betrayal of their one-time friends. And it's hard to take in. It's hard to look at. And the lesson here is that forgetting to consider the future does not eliminate its consequences. Forgetting to consider the future does not eliminate its consequences. That's no excuse. And in chapter 2, Jeremiah describes Jerusalem's destruction. As a judgment, the Lord destroyed the city in anger. We see in chapter 2 what God is doing. It says in verse 1, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. Look down to 2. The Lord has swallowed up. He has not spared. Look at verse 3. In fierce anger, he has cut off all the strength of Israel. He has drawn back his right hand. This has to be the hardest thing of all because God has removed his protection. You see, we don't realize how protected we are until it's no longer there. And God has just taken his hand and removed it. And basically he has just said, come what may. I'll let the enemy come in. I'm not going to interfere. And so God took away his hand. He abandoned the temple. They thought this would never happen. You know, God's presence was in the temple, but no longer is it there. And he silenced the prophets and the elders so that there is no word and there is no guidance from God whatsoever. That has to be the worst, to be left totally on our own, totally alone. And then Jeremiah delivered a message of blame to Jerusalem's unfaithful. Now, Jeremiah is hurt because of all the suffering that he's seeing, but he's primarily discouraged and hurt because of what he's seeing happening to the children. The children are deprived of food because the powers that be keep it for themselves. Jeremiah blames the false prophets for leading the people astray, but he also blames those who listen to them. And then Jerusalem is reminded of the judgment prophecies in past history. You will be astounded if you will go and look in Deuteronomy chapter 28, and you will see the verses of prophecy that were given to Moses by God of what would happen to these people if they disobeyed God. The astounding thing is that you can match those verses in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy almost word for word with the fulfilled prophecy, this judgment that comes upon these people in the book of Lamentations. It makes chills go up your spine. Given thousands of years before, but now coming true almost to the letter. There is a lesson here, and that is that disobedience to the Lord guarantees consequences from the Lord. Our disobedience to the Lord guarantees consequences from Him. Jerusalem, in chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, experiences horrid atrocities. This is really difficult to read. There is no rest, there is no relief, and there is starvation in the city. And apparently, when there's starvation, the desire to live and survive kicks in such a way that the unthinkable happens. We're told, as hard as this is, especially for women, I think, to hear, that mothers were so hungry that they were boiling their children and eating them. There was cannibalism in the city of Jerusalem. God's priests and prophets were killed. The young and the old, it made no difference, were struck down in the streets. They'd just as soon kill a child as kill an old woman or an old man. No one escaped. It was a horrible time. The lesson is that God's word will come to pass sooner or later. God's word will come to pass. He is faithful and He does what He says. In chapter 3, Jeremiah describes his despair. This makes this book really personal, and I hope you relate to some of this. Jeremiah voices feelings of personal depression at what he sees. Sometimes we're horrified to think that a Christian would be depressed. How could that be? And we cover it up because it's not something we want to talk about. But I'm here to tell you that depression happens to Christians as well as it does to others. Sometimes our circumstances are almost beyond what we can handle. And we feel just like Jeremiah did. And I want us to see what he has to say because I think we can really relate to this. First of all, he is in physical misery and he is starving. And he is hiding in dark places. At one point during the siege of Jerusalem, you've already heard, he was thrown into a cistern. And he was really left there to die, except God intervened and he was rescued. But I want you to see this part. Look at verse 8 of chapter 3. And we see that he says, even when I cry out and call for help, He, God, shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stone. He has made my paths crooked. Look at 11. He has turned aside my ways and torn me to pieces. He has made me desolate. Look at 14. I have become a laughingstock to all my people, their mocking song all the day. He has filled me with bitterness. He has made me drunk with wormwood. He has made me cower in the dust. My soul has been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope in the Lord. Would you say he's depressed? I would. Maybe you have felt like Jeremiah at some point. He's bitter, he's rejected, he's afraid. He's forgotten his happiness. Have you ever forgotten your happiness? Have you ever said to yourself, maybe not out loud, but you've said, I'll never be happy again. This will never go away. My life is so changed. So much has been destroyed. That's how he felt. He was without hope. He's making an honest expression. He's saying basically, this isn't fair. This is not fair. I want you to ask yourself, have I ever felt like Jeremiah? I'll be surprised if you haven't. Or if you haven't, you will at some point. Thinking everything has gone wrong, nothing is right, nothing will ever be the same again. I will never know happiness again. I've lost my joy. My hope is gone. Have you ever felt like Jeremiah did, that everything was wrong, that everything was just not like it should be? You had lost your hope, you were worried. I want you to hear the story of a young lady by the name of Jennifer Dell Campbell. Her circumstances were different from that of Jeremiah's, but she certainly had some of these same feelings.
I married a wonderful Christian man. We were married 3 years before we had our first child, and it was the fall of the year we announced to both of our families that we were expecting. It was the first grandchild on my side. She was just a great delight to us and our family. At her 4-month checkup we went, and everything appeared to be fine at that time. After her 4-month checkup, there were things, looking back on it now, that had presented before that. But between 4 and 5 months, there was some behavior, things that to us became more, looked more like she was potentially having seizures. She would cry for periods at time that we just didn't know why, and they wondered if it was colic or just a fussy baby or that kind of thing. Then one night, when she was 5 months old, we ended up at the hospital, and in the ER, she ended up having a seizure for the doctors, and they did confirm that that's what it was. They left us with that hospital visit that she had a cerebral palsy diagnosis, and that she had 30% brain atrophy, that she could have anywhere from mild to moderate cerebral palsy, and that there was the potential that it was some sort of disorder that was deteriorating her brain. We left with that. For me, I left that visit not wanting to accept that diagnosis, wanting to accept the cerebral palsy diagnosis. At 10 months old, we ended up back at the hospital for another week-long visit. During that visit, we got terrible news that Leanna's brain actually was deteriorating. She had gone from 30% atrophy to only 10% of her brain left. Leanna was put under hospice care, and we were told that she was given 2 to 6 months to live. Not knowing that she would see her first birthday at that point. We came home, and as my mom reminded me today, mine and my husband's 30th birthdays were within that year, and instead of having fun parties and doing things, we were buying cemetery markers and plots and, dealing with funeral homes and trying to make those arrangements. Through that whole process, it was great sorrow. I remember leaving one of the hospitals one night with just a heavy heart after that first hospital stay, and I remember crying and saying with Leanna's cerebral palsy diagnosis that, I just want her to live, and, just pleading with God, I want her to live. If she has, a disability, if she's mentally retarded, if she's, we will take this child that you've given us and love her and do the best for her. When Leanna was about a 1.5 years old, we found out that I was expecting. My husband and I have had several people and elders of our church that had prayed for us throughout the whole time. And to have another child for us, we were left genetically with a 1 in 4 reoccurrence risk. About 14 weeks into my pregnancy, I had some complications, and they actually had told me that I had miscarried. For me, that was really hard time. I had a daughter at home that was dying of a terminal illness. And I think for me, that was probably reality of, will I ever have children of my own? And I remember being told in the ER that night to just sit there and wait, that I had lost the baby. And they were busy. And finally they took me back to do an ultrasound. And they found a heartbeat. And they couldn't figure out what was going on or what the problem was. And so I was watched very closely throughout my pregnancy. And then in April of that year, Lizzie Kay was born. And her and Leanna are 2 years apart. And God blessed us with another daughter, which was a huge thing. And it was something Alex and I had prayed about, that, you know, we really, losing Leanna, would still love to have another daughter. So Lizzie Kay was born, and Lizzie and Leanna had a year together. I have learned that God is faithful, and even in the depths and the aching of pain, that He is there. So as Jeremiah in Lamentations, as he saw that deep sorrow and he looked around, you know, for us in the depths of that sorrow, how could we but love Christ? How could we but move forward and look to Him? What else do we have to turn to in our? I mean, you can't look at it and go, God's hand wasn't in it. I was 4 weeks pregnant when Leanna died, and I had no clue. And we have a son now that's 5 months old, and is the age that Leanna was when we first got diagnosed with her illness, and he's healthy.
The wonderful thing about Jennifer's story is that she has a turnaround, just like we're about to read from Jeremiah. We're going to see that Jeremiah has a turnaround. Look with me in the latter part of chapter 3, beginning with verse 19, and we're going to see that Jeremiah expresses faith, declaring that there is hope for God's chosen. And look at what happens to him. Let's look at verse 19. Remember my affliction and the wandering, the wormwood and the bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope. And you'll know this verse well. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is His faithfulness. Now what happened? Nothing. Nothing has changed except his attitude, because he remembers what God has done in the past. That is the greatest tool for overcoming depression, to remember what God did in those other times when you needed delivering. That's what he does. He recalls this, and he brings back to mind God's past faithfulness and how God has delivered him before. And that's what we need to do. So many times I've had to crawl into my prayer room. I didn't want to pray. That's when we need to pray, by the way, when we least feel like it. Crawled in there and have praised God when I didn't feel like it, and have remembered the times that He's delivered me when I thought I'd never see hope, never have happiness again. And nothing changes in that time that I'm there except that God renews my strength and reminds me of the times that He delivered me previously. That is the most wonderful exercise you can do. I like to call this my rocks of remembrance. And I do that because over and over in the Old Testament, God had the people pile up rocks so that when future generations would pass by and say, "What is that?" then they would be told that this is the time that God delivered us. This commemorates the time that God delivered us in a time of need. And I've thought, I need to have this little monument going. If only in my mind, I need to have rocks of remembrance. And that's what we need to do. And if you need to write those down, it's a great exercise. Sit down and do that sometime, that every time God pulled you out of a mess, every time when your hope was gone, what He did for you. And you will be very much like Jeremiah, and you will stand taller, and your hope will return to you, and your joy will be back. Now, Jeremiah realizes that God does only what's right and what's good, and he knows when he's thinking straight that God is in charge of all things, that there's absolutely nothing that God doesn't know about, and if something happens, God has allowed it to happen. And so with that knowledge, he can move on. God is in charge. So Jeremiah prays for God's mercy, and we find that in verses 43 through 66. He summarizes all the suffering again, and he prays, and the Lord answers. He is revived, and he is more confident. When you feel that you've lost all of your hope, you need to praise God for all that He's done for you, and thank Him in your present circumstance for what He's going to do. Beth Moore has a wonderful truth that has meant a lot to me, and I want to use it as our lesson in this passage, and it is that hope is believing God will, even though He hasn't. Hope is believing God will, even though He hasn't. We know that He can and that He will, and we need to cling to that thought, even when it seems very hard to do. Now, Jeremiah in chapter 4 describes Jerusalem's defeat, and Jeremiah witnesses the siege of the city and relays the conditions. It's not like he's seeing this from afar. He's right in the middle of it. He's witnessing it. He's seeing it, just like we witnessed some of those atrocities that I mentioned earlier. Nothing is as it was. That's a hard thing. Everything that you knew has been changed. And their sin is greater than Sodom. Can you imagine that? Why do you think that is? Because they had far more knowledge. They knew the truth. There were heathens in the days of Sodom, but now they have the law, they have the prophets. They know the truth. They've just ignored it. Now, Jeremiah states the reasons for Jerusalem's defeat. The Lord's wrath is accomplished, we're told in chapter 4, and He has poured out His anger. It's from the Lord. And none of the people, from the kings to the commoners, believed it. They didn't believe it would happen, even though the prophets had foretold it. So God showed them it would happen. God has warned them for over 1,000 years. Some would say He's too slow. Some would say He's not coming. He's not going to do what He said. But don't be fooled by that. Jeremiah predicts the enemy's future end. This was good news for Jeremiah when God said that they would not be in exile forever, that He would deliver them, and that there would be judgment on Israel's enemies. Jeremiah describes Jerusalem's despondency in chapter 5. Jeremiah confesses and intercedes for the people in prayer. Can you imagine, after the way they've treated him, he is continually praying for them? He still cares about them because they are lost, and he knows they're lost, and he loves them, and he wants them to come to the knowledge of the truth. Jeremiah pleads with God to intervene for his children, and he prays on behalf of himself and all of those in Judah, so that Judah might be restored. We may be thinking, this could not happen to us. I imagine that's what the people in Jeremiah's day thought. This could not happen to us. Even though it's happened to others, even though it's close at hand, it won't happen to us. We might better listen to the words of Jeremiah as he writes in his book Jeremiah and in Lamentations to see what can really happen. The people are saying, why? Why has this happened? Because we've been disobedient. Because we've sinned. That's why it's happening. How can a loving God let this happen? Because He is not an indulgent parent. You know, it's very true that we can come to Him just as I am, and I am so thankful for that. We don't have to clean up our act to come to Him. He'll take us just as we are. But as Max Lucado so aptly says it, but He loves us too much to let us stay that way. And therefore, He wants us to be like His Son, and so He disciplines us. And we can read about that, of course, in chapter 12 of the book of Hebrews, where it says, "My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by Him. For those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines." And it goes on to say that He deals with us as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? He disciplines us because He loves us and He cares about us. Obedience to God's word brings blessing. Disobedience to His word brings judgment or consequences that we may not like. But God's continual mercy is always available. It's new every day, giving us the opportunity to repent, to change our way, and to come back to Him. If we don't or won't, we'll suffer the consequences. But through every trial, there is the hope that God's mercy is offered to us. Just remember, great is His faithfulness unto me and unto you.